All right, Mike, are we ready?
Yeah, we've been rolling.
All right, cool. So we'll start in 5, 4, 3. Jarret Lovell, how are you?
Good to see you, Cameron.
Good to see you too. Welcome to the
Thanks so
Cameron
much.
Jackson Show. It's so exciting. Our history, we go back, Jarret and I go back to UCI, KUCI. I started at KUCI back in, that's the college radio station at the University of California, Irvine. I started back there 2004, I believe.
Sounds about right.
And you were there when?
I started there in 1990.
Oh my God!
I think
As a student?
As a student, I think I'm currently the third longest. I have the third longest tenure currently at KUCI. If we leave the broadcast media coordinator out of that equation.
Really?
So I did take a 7-year hiatus when I went back to grad school, or when I went to grad school back east, I should say. But I was still in touch with the station, doing the alumni show and whatnot. So I've been on the air about 22 plus years.
And what about the? Are you still doing the show now?
So I did Justice or Just Us, which was a talk show on activism and academia. I did that for 10 years, and at the 10th anniversary, I decided to
Pull the plug.
Pull the plug. It was getting a little bit tiring. It was also difficult to come up with new topics every week.
It's
Of course, if I
hard.
were on now, that would be a very different story. But I was trying to do things that you weren't going to hear on NPR, or you weren't going to hear on CNN or Fox or anything else. And I really was trying to have a activism angle. So I retired that, and I now do a music show every Monday night.
So you're still there.
I am still there.
What time is your music show?
It is on Monday nights, 6 to 8 p.m. in the Pacific time zone.
88.9
88.9.
FM.
I do reggae, funk, soul, Afrobeat, and jazz.
Nice. Is it a 3 hour or 2?
It is 2 hours.
2 hours.
Which is about long enough.
That's awesome. And what's your day job now?
I am a professor. I'm a professor of politics, administration, and justice at Cal State University, Fullerton.
So, we are probably, I don't know if we're on the opposite end of the political scale, but we certainly we are both very opinionated on our views. But really the primary reason that I wanted you here today was the fact that you've been in South Africa doing animal activism stuff. And it made me think of a funny story, not a funny story, but to me it was funny. We were in Bloomingdale's. That's the last time I saw you. And there's this long line of people coming through Bloomingdale's chanting, and you were in that group. What was that all about that?
So, and it's funny, I was telling a friend that story yesterday. So every Black Friday, right, the big shopping day after Thanksgiving that kicks off the Christmas shopping season, there's a national, it might actually be international campaign to try to convince some of the big retail stores that still sell fur to kind of ditch fur and go with some alternatives. And so Bloomingdale still has, or it did at the time, still sold fur and had, I think, an exclusive fur shop either at the top of the store, maybe it was down in the basement. And we were there to try to convince them, or to draw attention to the fact that they're still selling fur. And I think that's an easy one. I think that most consumers are aware. If people talk about, if we talk about being vegetarian or being vegan, as I am, most people understand that veal might not be the most humane thing, or foie gras might not be the most humane thing. They may disagree about whether there should be legislation to ban it, but that's fine. And I think the same goes with fur. Now, that being said, I'm more, for that campaign, I'm more of the approach of handing out leaflets. But I was with the group, and I guess we could talk about group mentality.
Well, listen.
It was harmless. We just walked through the store chanting.
That's what I was going to say. I mean, that kind of stuff is harmless. You make your point. Now, on the fur thing, though, my grandmother died a few years back, and I remember going through her stuff, and she had a fur coat. And to me, my generation, like, who the hell wears fur anymore, right?
Right,
Does
right.
anybody even wear fur? Is it an issue, or and was your campaign effective, or is it effective because you're there, or is it effective because, or there's no real effect because nobody wears fur anymore? Do you know?
It was last year or the year before. I forget which celebrity it was, but maybe it was the Super Bowl when Justin Timberlake did the halftime show. So that was just last year, I believe.
Oh, he did it again recently. I'm thinking of the one where he
No, not the wardrobe malfunction.
Right?
But it was about a Super Bowl or two ago, and the camera crew focused on one of the celebrities sitting in the seats, and the celebrity was wearing fur
I think I remember
from
that.
head to toe.
Yeah.
Fur is still used in fashion. Of course, these fashion magazines, nobody wears that stuff anyway out on the streets. I think it's effective because people are unaware that, some of these big stores are still hanging on. And when you have so many other retail outlets that now refuse to wear fur, and when some of the biggest fashion designers are making faux leather, faux fur products. I have a pair of vegan Doc Martens, right? And I have my choice of colors. Who would have thought that Doc Martens, right, would get on the trend and start making vegan products? So yeah, I mean, I don't think fur is nearly what it was. You watch old episodes of I Love Lucy, and she's begging Ricky for a fur or whatnot, right? But yeah, so that one's an easy one. I think one of the other easy ones is the circus. I would be outside the Anaheim Pond every summer when Ringling Brothers was there, and
do circuses even have animals anymore?
Not anymore, and of course Ringling Brothers called it quits. Our goal was not to get Ringling Brothers to call it quits. Our goal was to point out the fact that you could still have a circus, you could still have all of the excitement and the drama. You don't really need to have the animals doing it. And one could look to Circus Vargas, which has never had animals. One could look to Cirque du Soleil.
Wait, are you saying, when you say you didn't want them to call it quits, you didn't want them to go out of business?
We weren't trying to put them out of business. We were trying to get them to stop having wild animals as part of the show. And that was an incredible, the proof is in the pudding, right? That was an incredibly effective campaign. It was a true coalition with different activist groups, different celebrities, and the approach that we took, we really weren't asking people not to go, because the fact of the matter is, if people are showing up and they're showing up with their kids, they already have the tickets. So the organization, one of the animal rights organizations, was giving out coloring books. And it was coloring books about animals in the wild, where animals live, and it was educational. And we asked the parents, next year, please consider going to, different type of entertainment for your kids. A lot of the parents were very appreciative. They liked that we were giving out these free coloring books. Like, just listen to your podcast on comic books. Comic books on the mind. And there were some parents who turned around and decided they hadn't bought tickets yet, and they said, hey, why don't we go see a Disney movie instead, or why don't we go see something else? So that was a really effective campaign, but we weren't trying to shut down Ringling.
What do you think's going to happen with SeaWorld and the whales and the dolphins and all the...
I think SeaWorld's on its way out. Or if they persist, they're going to persist by getting rid of whales and the large sea mammals, and they'll essentially be an aquarium-themed amusement park.
See, I look at that and I say, okay, well, they're gonna fold at that point. I don't know how you stay in business if you don't.
I don't either.
Right.
But there we go.
They'll slide back just a little bit, and then they stop.
One would
right
think
there.
my fro would keep it in place. Yeah, that's a difficult one, because I don't. My goal isn't to drive people out of business per se, but
it seems to if your product is animals,
right,
and you can't. In Ringley Brothers' case, I would say, okay, you could have probably changed the way you did business, maybe turned it into more of a Cirque du Soleil type of thing to stay in business, but maybe that was their time to leave anyway, because they didn't have forward-thinking management. But there is that kind of byproduct of what you're doing could put somebody out of business.
There is. And, that's something that, concerns me as someone who cares about people having jobs. But at the end of the day, anytime someone is going to do activism, they have to engage in a moral equation, a moral calculation. If it's interesting because that's always an argument that people make, and the people that make that argument are often free market individuals who are trying to, put their thumb in the eye of activism. When the fact of the matter is, if you want to stay afloat in a free market, you have to be forward thinking. You have to roll with the times and adjust accordingly. And I think that the problem with Ringling Brothers wasn't just the animals. I think the problem was it was competing in a marketplace that has bigger and more spectacular summer blockbusters in the cinema house. You have video games. You have all the different amusement parks around the country. And you don't have to go out of the home now to see, stunts and entertainment.
Yeah, you can do it all from the
right
comfort of your home.
And you have the internet.
And you made me think of something while you were talking about that, and that is, do you think that activism leadership would be better done by people who have some life experience? Because it gives you a different, if you look at yourself as an activist maybe 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, and that arc of how you've matured over that time, and you have a lot more life experience now, you have a lot more perspective on things, which probably make you a better, more effective activist. Do you think that in a lot of ways, and I think this goes to our politics, we're seeing it right now with all these 20-year-olds that are being elected, Democratic Socialist 20-year-olds that are being elected to positions or potentially elected to positions. Youth is wasted on the young, right? And wisdom is probably better suited for a position in politics or a position in activism or a position in anything, really, because you have that ability to look at things globally. Do you think that the leadership for activism is better kept with, so to speak, the elders, somebody like yourself who can look at something and say, okay, that's a good idea, that's probably a little bit overboard, we could be more effective over here? Are we outsourcing too much of our activism to young people who really don't know anything?
Well, there's a lot in that question. I'm not sure. I mean, I guess the first thing we would have to do is define activism, right? Voting is a type of activism. Writing a letter to a senator or congressperson.
Yeah, when I say activism, I mean I'm looking at activism like you've decided that for instance, is that's just not going to be a thing, right? We're gonna go after fur. That's kind of the activism that I think of in my mind, and I think most people probably think of. Like, voting is not necessarily activism. That's just a civic duty, in my opinion, right? And so when I say activism,
when only about half of registered voters show up in midterm elections, and don't quote me on that statistic.
No,
but
you're
what
about
we're
right.
About.
Yeah, you're about right.
I mean, look, activism is a civic duty as well. That's why it's embedded in the First Amendment. So I don't think anybody needs life experience to know that fur is unnecessary.
No, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the tactics and the ways of going about activism.
I will,
because you look at activists
sure.
over time, like you look at Malcolm X, or you look at Martin Luther King, or you look at who is it that I was just thinking of that came to mind as I was saying that? I can't remember, but you look at them, and over time there's this kind of calming effect that time has on them, where they look at what they did in the past, like, whoa, that was kind of crazy. It would have been better if I had have done it this way. And that makes me think, in terms of activism, like politics, maybe it is better that older people are the ones who are kind of guiding that versus the young foot soldiers who are a little bit all over the place.
Look, social change has always been the vehicle of the young. And the reason that is because they realize the environment, literally and figuratively, that they are inheriting and demand change. I'm not sure that I completely agree with your narrative about the chilling out, if you will, or the maturation of perspective on activists. I think that typically occurs with people who start out embracing violence and then eventually recognize that nonviolence is perhaps, I don't want to say a more powerful, but you're able to reach a wider audience. Martin Luther King certainly didn't chill out. He expanded with the Poor People's Campaign. He expanded the scope of his activism and his critique. He was
but of course, in that context, he did not chill out. My context is that wisdom guided his way as time went on. I mean, it's always going to guide your way better.
But I think that's in any endeavor. I think if you're not learning as you age and as you progress, you're doing life incorrectly. So I don't know that we need to limit activism. I mean, there are issues that are more likely to affect the young than the old. There are issues that affect people in their 20s, whether it's student loan debt, whether it's more likely to be stereotyped about a particular religion or a particular race or ethnicity. That being said, do I always agree with the tactics? No, I'm not sure that, as I stated, that yelling in a department store on a day when there are children and families and it's supposed to be Christmas, I'm not sure that that's the most effective strategy. But I wouldn't have an age cutoff, and I wouldn't either in politics.
I
would have obviously certain age limits, but
my view is on politics. See, this is what I see as I look at the landscape. I see that 40 years ago, 50 years ago, 18-year-olds were way more mature in terms of life skills, in terms of life goals than 18-year-olds today, right? I mean, we have, and it's not, I'm not talking about intelligence. I'm not talking about that. I'm just talking about, like, almost in a way wisdom, right? I'm not saying that an 18-year-old 4 years ago was wise for their age, but comparatively speaking, I think that there was more of, even when I was 18, there was more of this notion of, hey, you're 18, get out of the house, go start working, and even before that, get married, have kids, and so that has an effect of making you mature younger. And so today I see the youth, and you're around them all day long at schools, so you're probably better equipped to talk about this than even I am. But we have 20-year-olds who are taking long breaks after school or even before school to find themselves. They're still living at home until they're 30. And I look at that and I say, okay, if you're not going to grow up when you're 18 and you're going to wait till you're 30 to grow up, then perhaps there's something to be said for raising the age limit for certain things that we do, politics being one of them, right? Like the president right now can be, 45, 40? What's the age?
I think it's 35?
35 maybe? Well, back in the day, in 1776, that was old. You were halfway done. I would say, maybe it should be 55. Maybe it should even be 60. Maybe the same thing holds true for congressional seats. There's not the level of maturity nowadays that I see that there was in the past. Maybe you have a different take on that.
I disagree. Yeah. I think there's a lot in what you said, and I think we're mixing a few different arguments. First of all, if we want to compare 18-year-olds today to 18-year-olds 40, 50 years ago, I mean, we began this line of discussion talking about activism. Let's not forget that the Fisk University students who were desegregating the lunch counters in Nashville, Tennessee, were undergraduates. They were students in their late teens and early 20s. And at the time, their behavior, along with those of SDS and SNCC and all of the other organizations.
What are SDS and SNCC? I don't even know what those are.
Students for Democratic Society, okay. As well as Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. They were viewed by the national public as being irresponsible, as being immature, as going about activism the wrong way. Every generation has a disconnect between their practices.
You're making me feel like I'm a grumpy old man now.
Well, myself included, right? I
Right.
look at, do I think shutting down freeways is the most effective tactic? Not at all.
Right.
At the same time, I also believe that, and this is a whole nother topic we could get into, but I'm worried about the state of activism today because there's this.
Oh, you could just do a hashtag and that's it. Is that what you're
Well,
talking
you
about?
could either just do a hashtag or, so many of the tactics today mirror those of the 1960s,
Yes.
right? A die-in. There's nothing shocking about a die-in.
Right.
It's been done.
Right.
Reminds me of the Great Simpsons episode where I don't know if for listeners who watch The Simpsons, when the Four Tops, the barbershop quartet, are standing on the top of Moe's giving a free concert, and George Harrison drives by in his limo, and he rolls down the window and he says, "It's been done."
Right.
Right. So I respect the need for new tactics. But that doesn't mean I always agree with them. And I think that that's part of the learning process, is knowing what works. The last thing I want is for someone who's 55 or 60 telling college students what's best for their generation.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with what you're saying on that, right? And I think what my thought was that it would be nice to just not have it all in the laps of the 20-year-olds because they are all over the place.
But it's not.
Yeah.
It's really not. So Friday is International Day of Peace, and I will be at a protest, and I will probably be the youngest person there.
Really? Mm-hmm. Really?
There will be some high school students. I stand corrected. Right. There will be some local high school students. There will be me. I'm a very, very young 46. There will be folks from Military Families Speak Out, Veterans for Peace. Yeah. So you're going to have an age range from about 15 or 16 to people 70.
Yeah, I spent a time in my life, it's when I actually learned to read again in my 20s. Not that I didn't know how to read, but I wasn't a big fan of it. And I delved into World War II and Stephen Ambrose. And if you want to read a great World War II book series, anything by Ambrose is excellent. And one of the things I had always had in your 20s, you always kind of glorify war and you think war is a great thing. And I came to this realization that war is horrendous. And I'm not saying it's not necessary. There are times when it's necessary.
And yet, if I could just interject,
sure.
And yet we send 18-year-olds with weapons to go fight them.
Well,
and so if we're concerned about
that prefrontal cortex just isn't developed enough. They don't know that they shouldn't do that.
Well, no, but what I'm suggesting is if we're going to be consistent about having age limits on trying to bring about social change, trying to make policy happen, to sit there and turn to people who are asking for department stores not to wear fur to have an age limit, or for society not to have certain practices that disproportionately impact certain people, whether for race, religion, or socioeconomic status, to look at war or law enforcement or whatever, where people are having a license to go out and make changes that are irreversible. The reason why I'm a proponent of nonviolent activism, as Gandhi stated, when you engage in nonviolence, if you find out you're wrong or you change your mind, the only person you've caused harm to is yourself through embarrassment. When you start engaging in actions where you engage in violence, if you find out you're wrong, you've not only caused harm to yourself, but to other people. So if we're going to have this, and I want you to finish your point, but it just struck me that we're talking about war, and we're talking about people who are being asked at the age of 18 and 19, who on the one hand you're suggesting may not have the maturity or the life experience to make proper decisions nonviolently, and yet it's okay to make decisions violently. Now, the counter argument to that is they're not the ones making the decisions; they're the foot soldiers.
That's what I was thinking. Yeah, that's what I was thinking. But I mean, I think that the conundrum you have there is you can get an 18-year-old to go face the.
You could convince an 18-year-old that this is the right thing.
Right, but
to
as
do.
mid-40-year-olds, we look at it and we're like, nah, we'll pass on that one. Yeah. So where are you at then in terms of the activism? The South African thing is absolutely
Well, so to clarify, I'm doing more academic activism.
okay.
So what we're doing is so I lead the Cal State Fullerton College of Humanities and Social Sciences South Africa Study Abroad program. And so for the past few summers, myself along with 15 students, we travel to Cape Town, South Africa. We spend 28 days there, and we have 2 quote-unquote courses. We're never actually in a classroom, but there are 2 intellectual lines of inquiry. The first is it's 2+ decades past the end of apartheid. This summer it'll be the 25th anniversary. And so we look at how is the country doing post-apartheid. So we study the history of anti-apartheid activism, which includes a lot of what we're discussing now, kind of the different tactics and the different approaches and that were taken. We look at the new constitution. Nelson Mandela did amazing things when he put together a new democratic South Africa. He invited members of the apartheid government to serve with him as a sign of
Unity.
and reconciliation. They created a system of proportional representation for gender in parliament so that women were guaranteed a certain percentage of seats. South Africa is the first country in the world to have the LGBT rights written into the Constitution. The first country in the world to allow for same-sex marriage. That happened in 1996. It took another 10 years for the U.S. Supreme Court to recognize that. And they created a system of reparations for the crimes of apartheid and created a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which is interesting because they had a desire to not hide the past, to not say, oh, well, that happened so long ago, can't we move on, but to have it part of permanent government and public record. So what we do when we're there is we meet with the Women's Legal Center, which is a gender advocacy group, maybe similar to an ACLU or any legal advocacy group where they take test cases and argue it up to the country's highest court as a means of setting precedent. We meet with them and we find out, okay, so how is this gender equity thing working?
Which was my question. How's it working?
Well, it depends on the different measures, but it's not doing too... I'm not the best spokesperson being a white American male.
Well, I just look on this... When we started saying this, I'm thinking to myself, yeah, they may have legalized that stuff 10 years before we did, but in practice, did it really...
South Africa
how'd that work out?
South Africa has the highest, and we'll have to double check that statistic, but I will say among the highest rates of rape and sexual assault in the world. So certainly by that metric, access to political power has not properly impacted the patriarchal or this male-dominated aspect of society. Certainly, there seems to be some aspects of LGBT rights in South Africa. We do meet with the Triangle Project, which is a Cape Town-based LGBT resource center. And their narrative seems to be that it's very class-based. So, for example, if you live in the nicer parts of Cape Town, you've got parts that are Malibu, beachfront communities.
Yeah, I've seen them,
And then you've got the townships. In the townships, homosexuality is not tolerated. In the wealthier communities, nobody cares. So the narrative...
Is that separated by race, too, then? Because I would assume that
And also, well, the townships are
predominantly black, right?
Black or non-white.
Right.
What is referred to as colored, and that's the politically correct term in South Africa for Cape Malay or people of mixed mixed races. So there it tends to be a little bit more class-based, the homophobia, but there's also a very masculine aspect to it. So if women are lesbian, there is a sense that they are depriving males of partners. If a male makes a move on a woman and she is lesbian, there is a sense that it is an affront to his masculinity. Mm-hmm. So there's still that gendered aspect in it, but it seems to be, again, based on the people that I've spoken with, there's definitely a class and gendered aspect to and homosexuality. So I agree with you. Just because something is on paper doesn't mean that it carries out in practice, and that's exactly what we're there to study.
Right. Are they actively trying to change that in South Africa, or is it just kind of status quo there, in terms of those things? Because
I'm probably
there's
the
so
wrong
many
person.
Problems going on in South Africa right now that seems to be like low on the totem pole of things to try to change.
I wouldn't suggest that that's one of the priorities. The resource center that I meet with is more about education, providing information about what the rights are, providing safety for people who are being targeted or abused, access to health resources, access to condoms and birth control, and a whole bunch of other things, and doing some kind of legal advocacy, if I'm not mistaken, as well as basically pounding the pavement and letting people know that there is an LGBT community in South Africa.
And while you're there, have you been witness to or kept up with this new government policy of appropriating the farms and taking farmland away from the farmers? In this case, they're white farmers, much as Zimbabwe did many years ago. Are you up on that stuff?
Well, it's not really a new policy. A lot of this was written into the Constitution. This was part of the reparations that I mentioned. Now, there are aspects of it that are new. If I'm not mistaken, it is about the amount of what's the word I'm looking for when you I'm just blanking out when you
like how much money
compensation,
you give? Compensation.
Right, compensation.
Got it. Yeah.
So the narrative, the narrative that was sent out at who knows what time of the day, with either 140 or 280 characters, is not really the best way to talk about a century-plus policy of either formal apartheid or informal apartheid that created a system of land displacement, homelessness, a diaspora. So is there violence in South Africa? Yes. Is there violence against white farmers? No. There's violence. The murder rate is higher for black South Africans than for non-black South Africans, and the murder rate in general, particularly for white farmers, is on the decrease. That was just a ridiculous tweet that the president sent out that created a lot of misinformation. Now,
well, but to be fair, and I'm not, and again, I want to preface this before I go forward, because everybody's, you got to say these things. I am not a Trump lover supporter on all the crap that he tweets out. Right? I mean, he tweets out just most of it's nonsense. However, having said that, I had been looking at the South African issue for quite some time, even before his tweet came out. I was weeks or months ahead of Donald Trump in that particular issue, and what I was gathering from it was that it was becoming dangerous, and that there was violence against farmers, and that we had I don't even know what the leader of South Africa, what his name was, but I know that he was saying, it sounds horrible that I don't know, but he was saying, basically,
Jacob Zuma.
Yeah, Jacob Zuma, we may have to kill him to take the land back, and that to me sent up a lot of alarm bells of, whoa, wait a minute here. is that really the right thing to do? Or is that how we're going to end this experiment that we had down in South Africa that started with Nelson Mandela?
I would have to look at the context of when that was said. I was not aware of that.
Yeah.
That being said, let's also point out that he was removed from office.
Oh, okay. Well, there you go.
He was removed from office dishonorably.
Okay.
He was forced to resign. He was also involved with corruption and connections to different families that had undue influence. So he's out. So
who replaced him? Somebody that's going to do a little bit better on that?
Yes.
Okay.
I think what we need to look at is, any discussion of South Africa has to take into account the policies from 1948 forward.
Sure.
And, that was why when you and I had an exchange, off of this program, you asked me, the situation of the white farmers. And, I very, cleverly wrote back talking about the situation of black and colored South Africans, because that's the real story. We could look at the dog bites man or man bites dog.
Right.
And I think that's a perfect example of someone who is a world leader.
Are you talking about Mandela?
No, I'm talking about Donald Trump.
Oh, Donald Trump. Oh.
Very, very cleverly ignoring the large suffering and focusing on the victim that more closely resembles him. We can make the same, and that shouldn't surprise anybody. This is a person who said there are good people on both sides.
Oh, at Charlottesville, yeah.
Right. Now, that's just the wrong thing to say.
Of course.
And it's particularly, yeah. So if we want to have a discussion about South Africa, then that's fantastic. But then let us discuss the long-term ramifications of these policies of land being taken away from black South Africans. One of the things that we do when we visit Cape Town with my students is we visit District 6. Now, for listeners, District 6 was an area, along with many others, that was either racially and culturally integrated, or it was an area that was an all-black or an all-colored neighborhood. District 6 in particular was right in the heart of Cape Town. To the left, you had the majesty of Table Mountain, one of the 7 natural wonders of the world. To the right, you have the water. And in 1961, when the government, the apartheid government, was enforcing its policies of land redistribution, sound familiar? What they did was they declared District 6 a white-only neighborhood. They sent eviction notices to all of the people in District 6 and forced them to relocate to these townships, half hour, many miles outside of the city. And then the government bulldozed District 6 to create a white-only neighborhood. Now, it just so happens that for some reason there's a case that sparks international attention, even though they had been doing this in many other areas of Cape Town and South Africa. But the whole world was watching, and so to this day, District 6 remains half undeveloped. And instead, it is considered, there's a museum that opened there, and they give walking tours of that neighborhood. That's the context in which we should take a look at policies of land redistribution. Is it taking something from white farmers, or is it trying to give back what was taken to South Africans, to black South Africans? Now, that being said, that doesn't mean that I believe that the best policy is to take land away from anybody and give it to, black South Africans if they're not farmers, if they live in cities and urban areas. But any discussion has to take into account the entire thing. If you punch me in the gut, and then as I'm punching you back, somebody walks into the room, the only thing they're going to see is me punching you back. They're not going to get the whole context. And all I'm suggesting is if we want to have an honest discussion about the quote-unquote white farmers, and it really shouldn't matter if they're white. We could just simply talk about farmers.
Right.
anybody getting
Well,
killed.
but in that part of the country, I mean, there is going to be more sensitivity, and there's going to be more of a delineation between white and black, or colored, as you say, because
then
of what's happened there.
then we have to talk about apartheid.
Yeah, of course. And so then what is, in a perfect world then, what's the solution?
I can't answer that. I'm an American.
Well,
but
you've been there, you've looked around, you've talked to people. I mean, if you, it's okay to render an opinion on that based on what you've seen.
Well, I wouldn't say that I'm qualified to render an opinion simply because I've only been there. If you add up all the time that I've been there, it hasn't even been a year.
Right.
I've been there for the past 3 summers.
How about I change that question then?
Well, I'll say this.
What I'll say, I'll change it for you to make it maybe a little bit easier. The people that you've talked to there, because I'm sure people have an opinion there about who've lived there their entire lives. What do they say that the policy should be, or how that should be fixed?
Well, again, there's no monolith response. Different people have different responses.
Right.
When I'm there, I certainly still hear views that are sympathetic to apartheid, very unapologetic, very open comments where I'm there and people see that I'm white and they assume that I sympathize with the apartheid government. I will say that when we read about the compromise that the country was able to strike when Mandela became president, and we look at the policies since, the end of apartheid was really a racial compromise. It wasn't an economic compromise. Now, those were in the promise of reparations, but what really happened was the first thing that changed were all the policies on race. Did nothing to address class, and yet we know that race and class are almost inextricably linked. So going to Cape Town is like stepping back in time. All of the workers are non-white. All of the owners are white, no matter where you go. And yet whites are 10 to 20% of the population and non-whites are 80%. So it doesn't take long to recognize, and then of course when one looks at the townships which are ever expanding, and the reason the townships are, when the government was declaring neighborhoods white only, they were relocating, very much like the ghettos in Germany, they were relocating non-whites into quote-unquote government housing. They were basically barracks. When we see the shanties across South Africa, a lot of the reason for that is you're given this government housing, but you have no money to actually create a business. And you're living so far from the city center that it's very difficult to get a job. One, because you've got to pay for transportation, and that was a deliberate strategy to keep non-whites financially dependent. So what a lot of people do in the townships is they give up their government house. They rent it out to somebody else. They take the rent money and they build a shack. And they tap into the electric supply and so on and so forth, and then they start their own business. And the business that they start, it might be a barber shop, right? Just right there, they build their own, makeshift in another shanty from collected things and so forth. And so what happens then is you end up having these townships with 2 million plus people, some of whom are living in the shanties and some are living in the cement blocks. Now that's a perfect example of an economic policy that is set for disaster, right? There's been so-called racial equality with the end of apartheid, but you need to have a real meaningful way to bring about economic equality if you also want to bring about racial equality. How to do that? Well, South Africa has lots of different policies. They have tax incentives for businesses that hire a certain percentage of non-whites. They're supposed to have some kind of not land redistribution, but certain loans. They have what's known as the Black Empowerment Project, I believe, and there are, again, lots of tax incentives and government loans and things of that nature. It's beyond my area of study, but when one sees townships that are expanding, rather than shrinking. 25 years after apartheid, you know that there's a fundamental problem in terms of economic equality. And that's the result of simply compromising on race.
And
And that's not to disparage Mandela or any of those efforts, but it was a very short-sighted approach to ending apartheid.
And so what's the end game there? What do you think is going to happen? Do you think it's going to fall apart and degenerate to chaos, or is it going to just kind of limp along the way it's limping along now?
I think it's, I don't think it's going to devolve into chaos. I think the people of South Africa have a rich history. I think they're tired of chaos. Mm-hmm. I think the whole world pays attention to South Africa. It's the wealthiest of the African nations. But you do see a lot of student activism. Again, we come full circle to talking about the role of students. You have a 25% unemployment rate. And there are a number of reasons for that, but you have a 25% unemployment rate. It's 40% for, let me double check because I did bring this one. It's 40% for Black South Africans, and it's particularly high for people of the age of like 18 to 35 or whatever, college and graduate school graduates. And so there's been a lot of student activism on the different universities because, again, they're inheriting a environment that isn't living up to the promise that was set 25 years ago when apartheid ended. And it has proven to be, very, very troubling. What is going to happen from that? I'm not sure. The African National Congress, which was Mandela's quote-unquote party, it was a group as well as becoming a political party, they're struggling to hold on to power. There are different groups, Democratic Alliance and the Freedom something or other, that are competing for political power. So I think there might be a political shakeup, but I don't think it's going to devolve into chaos.
And do you think that overall, though,
prefacing all of this that I am a total outsider
Well, yeah,
and
yeah,
probably
yeah,
the
but-
least qualified person.
well, you're more qualified than most because you've been there and you've been on the ground.
but I can't even remember
right?
the name of the other political party.
Well, that's
so
okay. That's okay. I mean, there's a lot of them, right? I mean, I remember seeing the
Sure.
ballot for.
They have 11 official languages.
Right, and I remember seeing the ballot once for South African Congress or whatnot, and I mean, it was 10 feet long. There's like 10 million options on there, which makes me think that there's a couple things when you're talking about that. I'm thinking, okay, well, there's probably a lot of just tribalism in general, and I don't mean that tribal like in the African way that we think, but I mean there's a lot of tribalism there, and but that's hard to overcome, and I don't know that you ever overcome that. But one of the things that I was thinking of more importantly was are people there happy, or are they fundamentally unhappy and suffering?
I can't.
What's your sense? I mean, what's your sense when you're there?
I mean, my sense is that people are happy. I mean, we do visit one of the townships, and there's a big discussion that we have about whether we should visit a township. Is this some kind of poverty tourism? At the same time, if I'm leading a group of university students to study the question, how is the country doing?
Well, you got to go and look.
You've got to go and look.
Yeah.
We do meet with folks there.
I'd say that's a far cry from tourism, just so
Sure.
you feel better about it.
Sure, but they do offer tourists tours as well. We
That's a little exploitive, even from my neck of the woods.
well, it's exploitive if, again, that's a whole nother topic, and given that I'm not the subject of the tourism, I can't really comment if it's exploitive. But we meet with people, we go into their homes, we see that there are different homes, we see the barracks, we see the
Shanties.
the shanties, we see the nicer ones. People are very proud. We visit one of the schools. There are businesses, brick and mortar businesses within the townships, and yet the entire time we're aware that we're being shown,
The good stuff.
The good stuff. Are people happy? That's a tough question. When people read narratives of the Holocaust, right? You read Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. You hear about comedy within the concentration camps. People adjust to their environment. People make the best out of a given situation.
You know, I've heard you say that a couple times, where you talked about in Germany being moved to the ghettos, and then you brought it up now, and I think there's a distinction that we need to make there, right? I mean, these people were moved against their will, but in terms of like Nazi level extermination and concentration camps, that's not happening in South Africa. These people are still, they're not being shipped off, right? I mean, we need to make a distinction and not conflate the two.
Yes, so that's an excellent point. One of the things that we do when we're there is we visit the Cape Town Holocaust Museum, and there is one there. And we, again, because we're a university, we get a special docent and so-called behind the scenes.
And what was the Cape Town? I wasn't even aware there was a Cape Town Holocaust. What happened?
It is absolutely not a Cape Town Holocaust Museum.
Oh, okay.
And so a lot of refugees from Europe came to South
yeah.
Africa.
My best friend growing up is from South Africa. He's Jewish. So that's what you're talking about.
Right.
The Jews that were displaced to South Africa, and they have a Holocaust museum.
And there is a Holocaust museum there. And one of the things that we are cautioned about is comparing what took place in Nazi Germany with what took place in apartheid South Africa. One was genocide, one was not. That being said, the apartheid government based many of the policies of apartheid on the policies of Nazi Germany. And so
ironic all the way around.
Sure. So yes, one was genocide, one was not, and that's a very important distinction. But I bring it up because it's pretty documented. It's pretty well documented that there was a little bit of cross contamination, if you will. So I mean, people adjust to their environments. There's also the thing, if you don't know any better, but are people happy? The university students certainly aren't happy. They've
what university students are happy these days?
Well, and we could discuss that. One of the things
I do want to talk about that.
One of the things that's very interesting, and this is something that I struggle with. One of the things that's very interesting is the Down with Rhodes campaign in South Africa. So Cecil Rhodes, the colonist imperialist, had there was a big statue to him at the welcoming steps.
Have they torn it down?
Of Cape Town, South Africa, of University of Cape Town, which is the Harvard of the African continent. And the students demanded that it be taken down, and I believe it was within a month that the university administration agreed, and they took it down. Now, when I look at some of the discussions in the United States, should we change the name of Wilson Hall at Princeton because President Wilson was against integrating the campus and so forth? Part of me is a little bit concerned about, well, what are we doing to history, right, and so forth. But when I go to Cape Town and I see all of these statues to figures who were prominent in the apartheid government or the policies that preceded apartheid, to me it's a no-brainer. Why would you create a new government? Why would you create a new system of unity and still keep all of these emblems of disunity? And to me, that has been one of them. I mean, me having an opportunity to study in South Africa has been the single most rewarding experience in my professional career, in part because it's really forcing me to question all of these things. I think if people thought about it in a different context, they would say, well, of course, why would you keep a statue at the entrance gate to somebody like Cecil Rhodes, particularly when the unemployment rate for these very university students, they're going to graduate into an economy that is not providing them with any resources. One of the reasons proffered for why apartheid fell when it fell, the entire apartheid system was based on a two-tiered or separate and unequal educational system. You had the Bantu educational system for non-whites, and then you had the educational system for whites, and one was primarily designed to provide professional training, and the other was providing menial training. Well, by the 1980s, the entire economy and marketplace had changed. It became an information-based, not a manufacturing or manual labor base. So by the 1980s, you have 10% of your population that's trained in all of these the new economy, and you've got 90% of the population that's not. It was a system designed to fail, right? Yeah. Economically speaking, right? Now we've got the internet and computers and all these other things. Well, this is catching up with them when you've got an unemployment rate at 25% and 40% for Black Africans. So college students certainly have a right in South Africa to want a monument to the progenitor of apartheid policies to be removed, and they certainly have a right to take to the streets demanding some kind of change.
Yeah. Well, I think that's
not just a right. Obviously, they have a right, but I think they also have legitimacy behind that claim.
And I think this is a good segue to college campuses here in the U.S., one of which that you work on, Cal State Fullerton. I think back to my days at UCI back in 2004 when I got on the campus. And I can remember being very vocal politically. And I wrote for the college newspaper. I wrote an opinion section. And I had my radio show where I talked about conservative politics. I actually spent a lot of time railing on Orange County Republicans more than anything else because, frankly, I disagree with the majority of Orange County Republicans in terms of the shenanigans that go on here. I have equal distaste, of course, for the state at the state level with the Democrats. But I look back at the things that I talked about back then and the things that I wrote back then, and it would never in a million years be allowed today. Like, free speech on campus seems to be an afterthought. What are your thoughts on that? Do you see it the same way? Where's it going? Where's it headed to?
I mean, I'd be interested in maybe an example, but yeah.
Well, I think the example is look at people like Milo Yiannopoulos or Ben Shapiro or who else would be an example? Somebody comes on to a campus that gets shouted down. What's the guy? Dinesh D'Souza, right? Mm-hmm. Anybody who is on the right is going to get shouted down on a campus today, even to the point of rioting. Look what happened in Berkeley with, was it Milo Yiannopoulos? I mean, they burned the campus down. I mean, it's insanity. But if you're on the left, good to go. No problem. You can come in, you can say whatever you want, right?
Well, I'm not sure I agree with that.
Okay. Well, give me an example of where somebody on the left has been shut down.
Well, several years ago, I brought Norman Finkelstein to campus.
Who's that?
Norman Finkelstein is a critic of the Israeli government, and he tends to take many pro-Palestinian perspectives. And I brought him to campus along with the student group that I was advising. So I should say the students brought him to campus. And people in the community were up in arms, figuratively speaking.
Right.
So, I think first of all, I think we've got to remember that we hear things more today. The internet is in our face. You can't get away from information. So I'm 40.
It's the tabloid section 24/7.
Right. I'm 46, and I'll read a 400-page book. And then a month later, I can't remember the details of the book. And part of me wants to know, is this because I'm in the early stages of dementia? Or is it because there's information overload? The news cycles don't last very long. One of my favorite books, if I had to pick one, I would maybe say it's in my top 5. It's a book by Nat Hentoff, who was, I can't remember if he's still alive. Nat Hentoff was a writer for The Village Voice. He did 2 columns. He did one, he was one of the nation's most beloved jazz critics. And also he did a column on free speech. And he's one of the nation's experts on free speech. He wrote a book in the late 80s, maybe early 90s, called Free Speech for Me, But Not for Thee. And it was the most important book I've ever read. I should point out it's the one book that everybody in my family, from the far left to the far right, and I do have them in my family, can agree on. And that's the one thing that has always united my family, is free speech. The book is filled with case studies of what today we would call snowflake college students.
Yes.
And it discusses people, a university. The one that I remember the most is the Hillel, let's say, the Jewish group on a particular campus. And all of these are Ivy League campuses or top, universities, which is also interesting, right? They wanted to bring someone who was very pro-Israel to campus. And some of the different Muslim student groups protested. And if I'm not mistaken, again, it's been a long time since I read it, so let's just go with the assumptions that I've got the details wrong. But the bottom line was either a bomb threat was called in or something had happened that caused the university to shut down that speaker. So no pro-Israel perspective for the Jewish group. Later that year, maybe it was a couple semesters later, one of the Muslim student organizations wanted to bring a speaker to campus. And wouldn't you know it, the same thing happened. Groups from the other side pulled the same stunts, and that speaker was canceled. This has been going on forever, whether it's individuals like Charles Murray, or Richard Herrnstein, or people who wrote The Bell Curve. That was the big controversy when we were students.
Oh, yeah, that was huge.
Whether it was someone like a Louis Farrakhan. So there are people on all sides of issues that have been blocked or attempts blocked from speaking on college campuses. I don't think that this is anything new. I think we're paying a lot more attention to it. And when you've got not just one, but 3 or 4 24/7 cable news channels that need to create news events, not just report them, it's completely in our face, right? And this has brought about the rise of Ann Coulters and Rachel Maddow's. It's brought about the Bill Maher's and the Bill O'Reillys. But I'm not sure that things are all that different. What is different is we live in a more inclusive society. We recognize LGBT rights. We recognize rights for Muslims. We recognize rights for immigrants, documented and undocumented. And whatever our position is on that very complicated issue, our Constitution grants rights to anybody who's here. And so what I think that means is that the nature of sensitivities have changed. There's a lot more to be sensitive about because we are becoming a more inclusive society. That being said, there are lots of things that are taking place on college campuses that I have some deep concerns about. Things like trigger warnings, things like
safe spaces.
People do not have a right to be safe from being generally offended. They do have a right to being safe from being personally offended. So if someone like a Milo is going to point to a specific person in the audience and single them out for race, class, gender, sexual orientation, immigration status, that violates university policy. That violates any university policy. I couldn't get away with doing that. But I don't believe that people have a right to not hear things that they disagree with or that offends them.
Well, and to that point, I think that's where it's headed.
I don't disagree.
Yeah.
I think that that's particularly problematic. We live in and I think part of the problem is that people pick their sources now. There are so many that it's very easy to cherry pick the sources of information we listen to and never have to hear something that offends us. And that is completely anathema to what the university experience is supposed to be.
Right, and what I see from the outside looking in is that the university is populated with leftists and leftist ideology, right? I mean, that's the majority of professors are going to be of the left.
Well, and again, I don't know if it's left or if it's liberal leaning, because there is a difference.
There is a difference, right? There is a difference. But the leftists get more of the headlines, unfortunately, right? They stir the pot a lot more, and they can pull the left leaning more in their direction. The problem, and listen, fine.
Well, let's back up. First of all, how do they get, what kind of attention are you talking about when you say that they get more of the attention and they...
Anytime that you're on the extreme, you're going to get more attention.
Well, let's back up.
Sure.
Because that's one of the things that I find very, very curious. When people talk about progressives on university campuses, they single out the social sciences, or they really single out the economics department or the cultural studies department. No one is telling a med school not to be progressive and to be forward thinking. Nobody is telling the psych program not to be progressive or forward thinking. No one is telling, in other words, wait a second, either you agree with conservatism and you want things to stay the way they are, or you recognize that part of a university mandate
but see what you're saying
is to be forward thinking.
Sure, but what that is saying is that everybody outside of the university is conservative, so therefore we have to be liberal. And what I'm saying is no. Fine, you can have left leaning and leftist ideologies on campus, but you've got to have some conservative ideas that are going to balance that out. And right now, if you're a conservative professor on a campus, you are in the closet. You are not. You can't poke your head out.
That's just not true.
So how many professors do you run across that either voted Republican or would talk about themselves being conservative openly?
I could think of one in particular.
One.
Wait a second. Now we're playing with words. I could think of a particular colleague whose office is catty corner to mine, who very openly voted for Trump. He teaches a lot of the criminal justice courses, is very openly conservative. Being in criminal justice is not the most progressive
very
discipline.
Yeah.
Economics departments are not the most progressive departments. I think that that's one of those stereotypes that needs to really be challenged. Are universities more accepting of leftist views? Well, certainly. We teach Marx and Marxism simply because we recognize that it's one of the most influential doctrines in Western civilization.
And it's a dangerous doctrine.
Well, it's got some dangers, and I would argue that so too does just about every other doctrine. I'm not sure that Social Security is all that dangerous. I'm not sure that Medicare is all that dangerous. I'm not sure that publicly funded roads and public schools and post offices and and fire departments. I mean, let's not forget that fire departments and police departments used to be privatized. So there are lots of aspects, right? Nobody complains that we've got public schools. They may not like them.
Yeah, I think when you say Marxism, though, Marxism in its extreme has been a failure.
Well, let's take a look at something for a minute, right? If we want to discuss, one of my favorite quotes comes from the sociologist Erich Hoffer, who in 1941 wrote a book called The True Believer. And the quote that I love from that book is, "Jesus was not a Christian, nor was Marx a Marxist," right? The idea being that if we want to judge Marx's writings, then let's judge Marx's writings. And if we want to judge what people who followed Marx did, then let's follow that. Because the same way we could look to Marx's writings, then look to some of the abuses in Cuba or communist China or anywhere else, we could do the same by reading.
Rouge.
Sure, we could do the same by reading the Constitution of the United States and then looking at our practices when it comes to genocide of Native Americans, our institution of slavery, and the post-Reconstruction era of Jim Crowism.
But those same people
or the
also
fact that women
changed
didn't. Sure.
for the positive.
Well, okay, but then we've got to recognize that there are aspects of all doctrines. Some are going to be better than others. Some are going to be good. Some are going to be bad. I'm not talking about dictatorships. I'm not talking about any of those things. I'm simply suggesting, just like we could say, should we throw out all of Christianity because people interpret different aspects of the Bible differently? Well, you have the Southern Baptists, and you have those that are completely welcoming, just like you could go from one extreme with the previous pope to the current pope. So let's stop writing off entire doctrines because of the practices of some people.
See, so where I would give you pushback on that is that if I look at, I mean, what doctrine would you even call being American? Americanism? Is that a doctrine?
Well, let's call it capitalism.
Okay, capitalism. Capitalism has not. Capitalism has changed always for the positive over time, and capitalism has made mistakes. The American way has made mistakes with the Indians, internment of Japanese during World War II, and other things. But it has never risen to the level of Marxism. You're talking 100 million people at least, and that's probably on the low end of the the low end of the estimates. 100 million people have been killed by their own countrymen around the world because of Marxism.
I would like to know where in any of Marxist writings he calls for genocide.
Okay, so
or he calls for.
but
I'm not an expert on Marx. So let's get back to the.
I think that's a good point to make. I think the problem though is that to get to that ideal, you can't get to that ideal without the suffering that must occur to get to that ideal, and that's the problem.
Where did Jesus ever talk about bombing countries? And yet every one of our U.S. presidents says that there's a mandate from God that God blesses America.
Well,
that they're doing this in the name.
I don't think they've ever done it in the name of God.
They appeal to the Bible. They quote the Bible. They say that we are a Christian nation, and yet I don't know any of the policies that the United States has engaged in that could be found anywhere in the Bible, right. Old or New Testament. So again, I'm simply pointing out, if we want to ask, do universities take the good from all different kinds of doctrines while acknowledging the bad? Absolutely. Absolutely. We're honest about it, right?
Are they though? Are they being, because I mean, when you have, for instance, I look now and I see we've got Democratic socialists winning primaries around the nation now. That to me is a little bit frightening, right? I mean, that to me is
why when you talk about capitalism improving, what types of improvements are you talking about? Are you talking about regulations?
No.
Are you talking about the fact that we have
capitalism has done more to bring people out of poverty worldwide than any other system known to man. It is the American system of capitalism that has spread throughout the world, since the World War II, till today. Poverty worldwide has dropped exponentially. People who are coming out of poverty are doing so at a rapid rate. When you compare that system to a pure socialist, I'm not talking hang on, to a pure socialist system or to a Marxist way of life, we got nothing but suffering and destruction out of those systems.
I think we should make sure we differentiate what we're talking about.
Sure.
Because first of all, we're lumping communism in with socialism. Those are not the same.
But they always kind of conflate together.
They are not the same. We are mixing capitalism, right? So you referred to pure socialism, but you've never referred to pure capitalism because there is no such thing.
Unfortunately, has been bastardized.
We have mixed economic models.
Sure.
I think we should pivot to a different topic because I'm not an expert on any of that. So I'm not going to discuss any of that. I'm simply going to point out again that if we want to talk about Marxism, let's talk about what Marx wrote. And I've only read limited Marx. I'll be very open and honest about that.
You know, and to be honest on that, I remember reading it in my poli-sci classes, and I actually want to read it again to refresh my recollection on it, because we do talk about Marx in a very negative way, and well, I do at least, because I've seen how it has been bastardized, right? To your point on the bastardization of capitalism, I couldn't disagree with you more. Or excuse me, I couldn't agree with you more, rather. Capitalism has been bastardized. Anytime that pure capitalism, I like to make this distinction because I think it's an important distinction to make. When I look at my interactions, I'm a business owner, and when I look at my interactions with other business owners in my profession, other private investigators, and I say to them, I need you to do job X, and here's what I'm willing to pay for job X, and I've taken my client and I'm charging them Y. That's pure capitalism, right? I'm offering a service to somebody else, and I'm paying somebody else to do that service for me, and we all can agree on a fair price, a market level price on that. And there's very, very little government intervention in that at that level, right? Between myself and the client and myself and the subcontractor that I may be sending something out to. It gets bastardized though when government steps in, because one company says to another company, we don't like how you do this anymore, so I'm going to get my government cronies to come in and create legislation that makes it harder for you to do business. And then that starts piling on top of itself and on top of itself. And it becomes one of these things that it gets out of control. And then you have things like, what do they call it? Corporate cronyism? What do they, where for instance, the agricultural industry is massively subsidized by the government. And that is, in effect, socialism, right? Is that not redistributing policies to say we're going to tax everybody? They had $1 trillion tax bill that went out right before Obama left office. $1 trillion tax package, 10 years, that goes to the agriculture industry. When these are all big, giant corporations that have no business getting a government subsidy anymore. And yet we do that. So I think, does that make sense? I mean, that's where I say that capitalism has been bastardized.
Again, this is completely outside of my area, but I will point out that each of the major collapses of our capitalist economy occurred after a period of government deregulation. Whether it's the housing market in 2008, and we've just had the 10-year with Lehman Brothers, et cetera, the savings and loan scandal of the late 1980s here in Irvine, Lincoln, and so on and so forth, right? So the idea that capitalism is just this constant success, and that when it's left completely untouched, right, that it works fantastically. History doesn't always bear that out. The fact of the matter is, we could take any ideology. Are there abuses of Marxism? When he talks about a dictatorship of the proletariat, yeah, I get kind of queasy. Yeah. But I also get a little bit queasy when I hear about, unrestrained capitalism, no checks on anything. I mean, that just, I don't understand the conservative mindset that wants to regulate so many things about people's lives except for the economy. Except for the economy. So, I'm not sure where I am ideologically. I'm somewhere between a socialist and an anarchist because part of me gets scared of a group mentality. part of me is anarchist libertarian. I got accused
Yeah,
of
wait,
being that, but
I would,
hold on.
I would say you're more libertarian, though. I mean,
I'm not sure, but I think that any ideology taken to its extreme is dangerous,
Yes.
and that includes capitalism.
Yeah.
We all like having a safety net. We all like having public schools where we know that the other person that we have to coexist with has a basic education. These aren't things that are controversial, nor should there be. And
I don't
in
think that-
terms of a university, I want a university where people are more open-minded. And I think that that brings us back to the whole topic of Milo Yiannopoulos and other people. I want professors from all sides of the political spectrum. I want students from all sides of the political spectrum. And I want them to be able to do what you and I are doing right now, which is hearing each other, discussing, and forming an opinion on their own. If universities tend to be, and I'm saying if, universities tend to be more left-leaning, I would posit it is because, by definition, conservatism is keeping things the way they are. And progressivism, as the name suggests, and I'm using progressivism not just in the economic sense, is moving things forward. Just like we don't want science to be stagnant, we want it to move forward. Now, people could disagree with the ideas coming from universities, but to accuse it of being forward thinking in some kind of pejorative sense, I think is misguided, and it is a silly form of slander on universities. Because whenever new things come about from the sciences, people are excited that universities are coming up with new ideas. It's just only in the social sciences that people don't want new ideas.
Yeah, I think it's probably because, I don't think it's probably, I think it is because those things touch on culture so much, and the way that we identify as our culture, and how it changes our culture. And I think that that's a lot of the backlash that we're seeing in the nation right now. I mean, I've heard this from other commentators, and I tend to agree with it. I mean, I think that, and I'm not trying to drag this into a political realm, but it seems to kind of parallel what we're talking about, and that is that Trump was a response to people on the right feeling like the left was changing the culture too much too fast, right? And I think that that's why the social sciences get banged on so hard in universities, because they are progressive, they are forward thinking, they are making societal changes. But when when things change too fast, that's when people start to get nervous. That's when people start to push back, and that's when people start to and especially in today's day and age with social media and whatnot, I mean, it just exacerbates everything, right? Everything. I mean, you have to admit, things move so damn fast now. I mean,
I don't have to admit that, and it depends on what
maybe I shouldn't say it like that.
It depends on what we're talking about. I'm not sure what was so fast about having to wait until the year 2008 to get the first African American president. I'm not sure how fast it was that the 13th through the 15th Amendments were ratified in the late 1860s, and it wasn't until 1964 and 1965 that racial discrimination actually ended. That took 100 years after the Civil War. So for people who think that that's too fast,
well,
or that it took from 1969, right? It took from 1969 and the Stonewall riots to what, 2016, when you could still fire someone with that Supreme Court decision for having a picture of their same-sex partner in their cubicle. So the people who say that things are going so fast simply don't like any change. They have benefited. It has been predominantly white Americans who are the ones who are saying that things are moving too fast. And I completely reject that notion, right? When is it the wrong time to do the right thing and simply acknowledge that there are people who don't look like you or don't worship the same God as you who deserve the same fundamental rights that the Constitution guaranteed. That is just and blaming universities for being the voice that's pushing that forward, that's ridiculous. Now, can things go overboard where the pendulum swings one way and another way, and it appears that any criticism of any movement was sure? And that's what we were talking about when we were talking about the Nat Hentoff book or anything else. But no, things are not moving to the idea that we still haven't had a female president.
So
and it doesn't have to be.
I have to give you a little pushback on that, right? Like what I don't like.
That's not an endorsement of any particular candidate.
I get it. No, I get it. No, I get it. I get it. But when you say stuff like, well, okay, civil rights and a black president are two totally and separate things, right? In my opinion, and a female president. It is not about what color your skin is or what gender you are when it comes to what job you have, period. And what? Hang on.
When voters were being turned away in Selma, Alabama, when black voters were given poll tests.
Oh, well, we had the same thing happen with Black Panthers at polls. You can't go. That's a non-starter for me.
You were saying that civil rights and voting are two different things.
No.
Or civil rights and a black president are two different things. But if the black population were disenfranchised from the vote until 1965.
That's not the point I'm making, Jarret. The point I'm making is that I am fundamentally for civil rights and people having equal access to opportunity, not equal outcome. When you start saying that you have to have a black president or a female president or whatever.
Not what I'm saying.
Okay, well, that's what it sounded like, right? Because when you start saying that you have to have those things, and I understand you weren't saying that, but that's what it sounded like, then that's the problem that I have, right? It was the problem I had when I worked in the public sector. When I worked as a police officer, there were quotas for how many black people there needed to be for sergeant, how many women there needed to be for sergeant, et cetera, et cetera. I'm fundamentally opposed to those types of things, saying that, okay, just because you're black or just because Hillary happened to be a female, we need our first woman president. No, we don't, actually. We need the most qualified person to be president. If it happens to be a black person, I don't have a problem with it. If it happens to be a woman, all day long.
I absolutely agree. Now, if we want to look at a measure of equality of any particular society, one of the measures of equality is the ability of people from different backgrounds to be able to achieve the same level of success.
And America does that better than any country in the world.
Well, I'm not sure that that's true.
Well, we had a black president.
We did have a black president.
So that's the problem that I have with that argument. It's the argument says that America is screwed up and we have and we're not equal and we don't have equal access to stuff, and yet we had a black president. So I have.
So you're going to look to a case study of one to base suddenly we've crossed this major threshold?
You have more opportunity as a black person in America today, as a Hispanic person in America today, as a Muslim in America today, as a woman in America today. No other country on the face of the planet gives as much opportunity to minorities and gender.
So wait a second.
It's true.
Wait a second. First, let's back up. Okay. If we want to talk about you want the most qualified person, okay, whether we agree with her policies or not, if you want to take a look at that last election, wait, let me make a cultural thing. Let me make this point.
Sure.
Okay. People are criticizing all these young socialist Democrats who are winning elections, saying that they have no experience in politics. Why should we let them in the House of Representatives? Yeah. We have someone who has no experience in politics at all occupying the highest position and doesn't seem to quite know what he is doing. Now, if we want to talk about people who are the most qualified to be president, I will acknowledge that if it was a choice between John McCain and Barack Obama, in terms of pure qualifications, John McCain would have been more qualified. That doesn't necessarily mean that the person is right for the position, but by any metric, one cannot argue that someone as a person as Hillary Clinton was far more qualified than someone like Donald Trump. Okay, so let's just make sure that we're having we're being consistent with our arguments. So, now, in terms of saying that an African American today has more chances of success than in any other country. I'm not arguing that.
Yeah.
What I'm asking is our country itself making progress? It is always easy. It is a stacked deck when you compare the richest and most democratic country in the world to countries that are not rich, that are developing. And so if we want to judge United States, let's judge the United States against its own words and its own principles. That's what I'm calling for. For me, for someone to say...
And I'd still say we're a resounding success.
If I had a horrible flu a couple of days ago, and today I still have the sniffles, for someone to say, yeah, but you're better than you were a couple of days ago, I'd say, yeah, but I'm still feeling ill. There's still room for improvement. And the United States is a country that should never rest on its laurels. And we shouldn't be happy simply because there was one African-American president. We should be happy when we no longer have to worry about whether someone is African-American. I'm so tired of hearing the first this, the first that, the first whatever, not for the reasons that conservatives are. Because for me, it's a sign of just how much more progress we need to make so that we no longer even have to notice that somebody is the first or not.
And I think, though, but to be fair here, I think it's the left that pushes that first notion more than anybody else, right? The left is the one that keeps those things up at the forefront.
Because they're historic.
Well, I understand.
And they're important indicators, and they're a reminder of how much more we need to come. And I think that that's important.
Sure. And I'm not going to negate that, right? But again, you know, let's go back on the Trump Hillary and the experience portion of it.
Again, this is not an endorsement of any particular.
No, I'm not either.
Of any particular candidate.
I'm not either. What I would have to say on that particular remark you made, and there's a huge distinction on that as well. And
I'm just talking about the consistencies of looking at people who are experienced versus inexperienced.
Politics is unfortunately, it's a different beast, as we both know. And Trump came as a response to Barack Obama, just like Barack Obama was a response to George Bush, right? We've got a lot of reactionary politics going on right now because there is a change happening in the country in terms of demographics. There's a change in cultural. There's a lot of changes going on, right?
But I'd like a response to whether to my comment about whether this change is going too quickly.
Yeah, no, I do think that it's going too quickly. I think that, you know,
in what regard? Can you give an example?
Too much too soon is never a good thing. And while it can, and it's never going to be fast enough for anybody on the left. Never. It's never going to be fast enough. They want it all right now, immediately. Once one thing is done, then we're on to the next thing.
Why is that a bad thing if people are being denied basic civil rights?
I'm not saying
I'd like to hear one example of something that you believe went too quickly.
So I'm not saying for myself that things went too quickly, because I'll give you an example, because I'm sure this is maybe what you're thinking. Gay marriage, for instance. For me, my entire life, I've looked at, I shouldn't say my entire life, since gay marriage became a thing, right, that was denied, my natural instinct on that was, well, yeah, who cares? If you want to get married, why is the government making any kind of decision on this issue, right? So for me, personally, I could care less. Get married. If you're gay, get married all day long. Should a gay person be denied any kind of right that a non-gay person is denied? Absolutely not, right? So for me, none of these changes that have occurred have been too fast, too much too fast. But maybe I'm unique. Maybe I'm a unique conservative in that I can handle those types of things. I don't think I am, actually.
And yet you're defending the conservative movement. No. You're understanding how they feel that it's too fast.
There's nothing wrong
now
with...
Now who's the snowflake? I mean, suck it up, people.
No, there's nothing wrong with understanding why it's too fast for a lot of people. There's nothing wrong with that. That for me is empathy, right? I empathize with people who are in the middle of America who have lived a certain way of life.
Sure, so long
Right.
as they empathize with people who have also been, so long as they also empathize with people who have been denied basic rights.
But the larger issue is this, though, is that you have an American culture. Let me change it. Let me change this for a second. We have Islam. We have large segments of Islam that believe homosexuality is bad. We have seen where Islamic Muslims throw homosexuals off of the roof of buildings because they're homosexual. We have seen where homosexuals have been executed in places like Saudi Arabia. We have seen these things happen over and over again in Islam. And yet, if somebody were to posit that Muslims should change and become progressive and not kill homosexuals, well, the outcry from the left would be almost, how dare you? How could you even bring something like that up? How could you dare want to change that culture? You're appropriating their culture. You're just the white guy telling them what they should and shouldn't do. And so I say, okay, well, if it's not okay for me to criticize Islam for their hatred of homosexuals, well then, why can't it be okay for a certain segment of Americans to say, hey, you know what? Give me some time here. Let me work through this. Don't shove it down my throat. I'm willing to make the change, but just work with me a little bit. Don't go so damn fast. We'll get there. That's what I see.
I don't even know where to begin on that.
What times? We've got to watch the time, because
to speak of Islam as a monolith is inappropriate. There are sects that take more extreme views, just like with Christianity. We would not sit here and say Christianity hates homosexuals, because there are lots of different sects and lots of different groups. You're also speaking to someone you may or may not know who has done research on the criminalization of homosexuality in Jamaica. I don't know if you remember that research that I did.
I think now that you mention that, I do kind of remember that.
So I'm not sure, speaking from someone on the left, that I would have a problem criticizing the policy of another culture, because the culture there is highly religious.
In Jamaica?
Correct.
Yeah.
Highest concentration of churches per capita of any country in the world. So I think people on the left, and again, I'm not sure what we're defining as the left, but I think people on the left are sophisticated enough to be able to make a distinction between religion and the interpretation of a religion. I think we're able to say, we want to respect all of your views as long as you respect that person's lifestyle. And I think what people are reacting to isn't that they dislike homosexuality, it's the violence. So let's call it what it is. Let's not call it having a problem with Islam. Let's call it having a problem with violence against another group of people, regardless of who it is. In the
name of Islam, though? I mean, it is. It's in the name of Islam.
I don't care if it's in the name of Mickey Mouse. That doesn't mean if someone is doing something in the name of Mickey Mouse, if some serial killer out there, well, let's take AC/DC.
But it sounds like you're giving Islam a break on this, though, right? I mean, it does kind of sound like you're giving them a break when you just say it's just violence. We don't need to worry about...
It is an interpretation of a religion that encompasses billions of people, and it is... What was that?
A billion.
A billion. It is an interpretation the same way... Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, famously wore AC/DC Highway to Hell t-shirt, and people wanted to blame AC/DC. A child committed suicide, and the parents wanted to blame Ozzy Osbourne's song Suicide Solution. We could all see how ridiculous it is, because people do things in the name of, or allegedly do things in the name of. Do we just immediately write off what they do, or do we say that person has some issues? And that's all I'm suggesting. Let us just be consistent. Now, the idea that people in the Midwest or in the South or wherever, right, people here in Central California, wherever it is, need more time. Let's get back to the beginning of this discussion where you have to do a moral calculation. Is my activism against the circus going to cause the circus to close down and people lose their jobs? That is a possibility, but it is never the wrong time to stop animal abuse. And if the people are there to say, we'll close down in the next 10 years, I'm supposed to look those animals in the eye and say, suck it up, Buttercup, you're going to have to suffer a little bit more. No. At the end of the day, there's a moral calculation. And I would ask anybody who cares about civil rights, as you claim to do, if you've got to side with the people who are moving fast because they've tolerated injustice long enough, or people who are worried that their religious views are somehow going to be encroached upon by someone half the country away in a state that they're probably never going to set foot in, are going to get married, that's a no-brainer. That is an absolute no-brainer. And I have no understanding of that. I don't understand. Conservatives want government to stay out of people's lives, except for gay rights, except for abortion, except for religion. And that is where you and I do tend to lean closer, because that is a very libertarian perspective. And I just don't understand that. I don't know what happened to true conservatism. Do you think Ronald Reagan would care about gay marriage? I don't know.
Probably not. I mean, listen, there's no doubt that.
But I think it is because people, it's losing ground. You've got white traditional America recognizing that the country is becoming more diverse in terms of sexual orientation, in terms of race, in terms of everything. And that is threatening. I get it.
I don't think that it's...
But I don't sympathize with people who fear it.
I don't think that it's threatening. I think that threatening is only if you are like kind of knuckle dragger-ish, does it become threatening.
I think we have a knuckle dragger in chief.
Well,
who fuels this, who plays on this kind of fear.
And
you had one of the most angry campaigns I've ever heard.
And I would say that Barack Obama did the same thing, just a little more slyly.
I would have to disagree.
I know, and that's we can disagree on that, right? But he didn't do anything to help race in America. He did nothing to help race.
What did he do that didn't help race?
Fanned the flames of racial hatred. Because all Trayvon Martin and Ferguson, hands up, don't shoot. The professor, the Beergate, those things, he just exacerbated those problems. He could have made those things so much better, and he made them worse.
We'll have to agree to disagree, but continue.
Yeah, so I think that, again, you've got to give people time to I always think of this story.
Wait. Time to what? Finish that thought.
Well, no, you have to give people time to become okay with something.
They've
right?
had the entire history of this country.
What's fast for you, or what your timeline isn't everybody else's timeline.
But you're choosing, at the end of the day, at the end of this conversation.
So I would say this to you. You say what's moral and right. Where does the morality come from?
I mean, I'm not. Look, my issue.
No. Where does the morality come from?
I'm not understanding the question. Whether it comes from God, whether it comes from the Constitution, whether it comes from natural law or the social contract. The bottom line is, conservatives can make a choice, right? They could live according to their ideals and want government to stay out of these things, or not. And for some reason, conservatism seems to care about what goes on in people's private lives, and I just don't understand that. And the argument that these things take time is the biggest cop-out, and I'm surprised. I understand what you're doing. I understand you're saying, that people who have, deeply held beliefs, whether it's religious, whether it's a way of life, that not every place is California or New York. Like, I get that part.
Right.
I get it. But that's about as far as my empathy will go when it denies people basic legal rights. And, you know, everybody said the same thing about civil rights in the South. That's why Martin Luther King's famous quote, "Now is the time." Everybody said, "You're moving too fast, Reverend King. You're moving too fast." I mean, I teach Martin Luther King. In his famous letter from a Birmingham jail, everybody criticized. That's what he was saying. They were saying, one, why are you coming into our town and stirring up racial trouble? Which is exactly what people in Middle America are saying. And he said, an injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And then they said, and why are you moving so fast? And he said, when would it be the right time? Because we were told, you know, when we were pushing, you know, the abolitionists now. I mean, so all one has to do is read American history and know that this is the same recycled argument over and over and over.
And yet, but let's be fair here. We always get there.
And I would argue we always get there, not from the push of conservatives, but from the push of people who want to bring about social change, the activists and the people who consider themselves progressive, not your religious conservatives.
Well, but the fact is we get there. And if it weren't for the tacit agreement of those religious conservatives, you would never get there because they outnumber the progressives.
Fine, but if we get there, don't tell the people who are struggling for change to slow down. Tell them to keep going. If you really care about that change, tell them to keep going and to keep pushing. But what I hear,
that's one thing that always fascinates me, though. And maybe this is the conservative in me, right? And that is, I view the left as like 5-year-old babies, as 5-year-old kids, because it's never enough. And at some point, like, is it ever enough? Like, or is it just insatiable? The amount of change that we have is insatiable. There's always going to be something that we want to change. And that's what I look at and I say, okay, how much change is too much change? When is it enough? What's the moral authority for that change? And how does our culture and our society cope with all of that change? Like, when is the end? Is there ever an end? Perhaps not.
You could never step in the same river twice. Things are always changing. The seasons are always changing. The day changes into night and then back into day. Our bodies are changing, right? Our cells regenerate and die off all of the time. The idea that we in the year 2018 need to live exactly as people in 1776 or 1789 or 1865 or 1964 deemed acceptable means that we're not a free people, that we don't get to determine our own fate. Why, as Henry David Thoreau, the great libertarian, said with regard to the law, if we're simply supposed to follow the law and never think for ourselves, why did the good Lord think well enough to give us all our own brains? So of course things are always going to change. Good luck holding back change in the universe. Now, I can agree. This is the age-old debate between liberals and leftists. Liberals want reform. The slow arc towards change. Leftists want it immediately. And I will acknowledge, again, getting back to our discussion, when you first met me, I was not for reform. I was for change. It's all or nothing. It's now or never. And I think with a lot of wisdom, I have seen how that's not always the best strategy. But I think without people calling for immediate change, you're not going to get people to accept reform.
Yeah, and I like how you put that, and I would say that when you put it in terms of reform, that's much easier for me to digest than I want you to change right now, right? Because I think there has to be, on certain things, some contemplation on how that change is going to occur. And if we're going to have reform should be a compromise. It should not be a totalitarian one way. This is the way that we have to do it. And it might not be, it might not make everybody happy, but oftentimes with policy and reform, when nobody's happy, then that's probably you've gotten to a good place, right?
Except I think there are some issues about which we don't compromise. We don't compromise on basic civil liberties.
Listen, here's the thing.
Or human right, international human rights.
Here's the thing, though. Like, we are so far ahead of the rest of the world in terms of all of those things.
No, we're not.
We are.
Again, South Africa had gay marriage and LGBT rights written into its constitution 12 years before.
You can say that all day long, but the problem is that if they're not doing it in practice, in America, we actually do it in practice.
We do it in practice in some parts, and in other parts, it's a lot harder to be out. It's a lot harder to have... we still discriminate. You can get a job in South Africa. You can get a job in South Africa. I'm not suggesting things
march towards
but
better.
Again, the question isn't how do we do compared to another country that we can clearly,
you just did it when you compared us to South Africa.
And now I'm saying that that's why it's wrong. Because at the end of the day, right? So here's what happens. When people are depressed, what do? They compare themselves to people who are better than them. So that, right? It's called Facebook, right? They compare themselves. Yeah. So anytime people engage in a comparison, the cards are always stacked because you only compare yourself, just like I did. You only compare yourself to someone that is going to prove your point. So let's compare ourselves to ourselves. Is America capable of better? Have we come as far as we should on things that should be so self-explanatory? So let's do that comparison.
Well, and so I would say, you've made me think now about the too fast, too much, too fast, too soon, all that argument. And what I would say to kind of bolster that is that, just as I described, it's like 5-year-olds. It's never enough, right? It's never enough. And I think sometimes it's hard to get reform and it's hard to get change when one side is always looking at the other side saying, God, can you just leave it alone for 5 minutes? Can I just have 5 minutes?
Give me an example.
Can I have a 5-minute break?
Give me an example of something that you believe has happened too quickly, or that you believe the left thinks has not been enough.
So again, for me, gay marriage is not an issue. There's a wide swaths of the country, take the flyover states, right, where it is a big issue for religious reasons, for cultural reasons, for whatever, okay? It's one of those things that you've got to just slowly integrate in. You're going to get there, but you gotta massage it.
When was getting rid of slavery?
Well, look,
too soon. I hear what you're saying, but again, at the end of the day, you have to make a moral calculation.
Sure.
And at the end,
whose morals?
Let's take the Constitution.
Let's take
conservative values.
Whose morals?
At the end of the day, right? At the end of the day, you, Cameron, need to take a side, right? Again, you could always change your mind, and this is why I'm a firm believer in nonviolence. You could always change your mind, but throughout this near 2-hour conversation, you continue, whether it's for devil's advocate's sake or whatever, side with people who are upset that they have to make way or be a little bit uncomfortable, which I find ridiculously ironic given your critique of university students. You don't have a right to not be offended by other people's lifestyles. But then stop defending or empathizing with them. It's the same way when you were empathizing with the white farm, or well, not you, when the president was empathizing with the white farmers rather than a history of apartheid.
I don't think
Either
there's anything wrong. I
empathize-
think by empathizing with somebody, though, I don't think there's anything wrong with empathy. I think that when you're empathizing,
when you have a choice to empathize with people whose civil liberties, people who still fear putting a picture up of their partner, or still fear wearing a hijab to work, or whatever it is, or you could fear with people who are upset or offended by somebody else's lifestyle. Again, which side is really being the snowflake here? Change is too quick? I mean, come on. Your whole mantra today has been that people need to be okay, and you don't have any safe space. Well, Kansas does not deserve to be a safe space from gay marriage or gay lifestyles or people who practice the Muslim faith. Just like being a Muslim does not give you the right to go cause harm to anybody who falls outside of your faith or who decides to engage in same-sex relations. It has to work across the board. But if people want to criticize college students and then simultaneously say, but you got to recognize that some people are offended by these changes, I say too bad.
Right.
I mean, be consistent.
well, I think I have been consistent. I mean, I think that having empathy for somebody else's point of view, there's nothing wrong with that. And I think that saying that change can be too fast for culture and for society, I don't think there's anything wrong with that either. And
You're empathizing with the oppressor rather than the oppressed.
I disagree. I disagree. I think that, again, whose morals?
That is a ridiculous discussion. We're talking about, okay, whose morals? Let's take the conservative mantra: live and let live. Live free or die, if you want to take a state motto.
That's probably more libertarian than I would say anything else.
Okay.
But I mean, whose morals? I mean, that's the question, right? These are your morals that you want to impose on somebody else.
But
whose morals may be
the country is founded on individual liberty, and I would agree that it is founded on these very libertarian principles.
Would you impose those morals on a Muslim?
Would I impose which morals? The fact that they have to be tolerant of homosexuality?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Would you?
In this country, absolutely.
What about in Saudi Arabia?
Absolutely.
Really?
Yeah,
Okay, fair enough.
absolutely. It is a basic human right.
Do you ever have those discussions with Muslim students on the campus?
Only if I hear them arguing against homosexuality, and I would be very honest and say I have never once heard that argument. Have I heard white students speak poorly about Muslim students wearing hijabs? Absolutely. And the answer is yes.
Are there any Muslim student unions that are for gays on the campus?
I haven't taken a poll, but I have never heard a Muslim student union say anything against gays. Whether it was any of my interactions with CARE or any of the Muslim student groups, I have never, ever heard that.
Have they ever supported, though, any gay groups?
Has the Republican Party on campus ever supported a gay group? I think you're putting an unrealistic litmus test. You're assuming that one group takes a homophobic position. One subgroup here in the United States, in Southern California, is somehow representative of an entire religion. And I'm not going to let you frame it that way, because that is a false frame.
I'm not framing it.
I'm
asking the question.
I have never heard any group on campus speak out against gays.
Even the Republicans?
Even the Republicans. I've heard them speak out against immigrants.
Do you want to know a dirty little secret about Republicans in Orange County?
Tell me.
About 25% of the elected officials and people in Republican circles are gay.
Well, I would say that applies to any group.
No. 25% is a huge number when you're talking about per capita. No, I'm not talking about Republicans in general. I'm talking about Republicans in power in Orange County. 25%.
My point is that we cannot paint with such.
Isn't that fascinating?
No, it doesn't make any difference to me.
But they are their policies have been anti-gay for years,
Well,
and
sure.
yet 25% of them are gay.
Hypocrisy is the greatest luxury.
Isn't that blows my mind?
But that applies across the board. Look at all of the progressive men who are doing horrible things to women and claiming to be part of the Me Too movement.
Oh
so
my
I mean,
God,
look.
yeah.
So there's,
What's our time? You're like 3 minutes away.
there's hypocrisy across the board. But the idea that we could somehow speak about an entire faith based on what a group in Orange County does, which they have not done. Again, just like we shouldn't even be speaking about people in so-called flyover states as a monolith. There is no such thing. So I don't care if it's a conservative here in Southern California or if it's a conservative in Southern Kansas. The bottom line is I don't think there's ever a wrong time to push toward the right thing to do. And I reject the idea that we're going too fast. Maybe one way to end is my philosophy is, I've always been accused of being an idealist. I remember from an early age, my parents telling me I was an idealist. And I remember like looking up in the dictionary, like, wait a second, it doesn't say in front of that word pejorative. It doesn't say anything about it. Who isn't an idealist? You want to strive for idealism, and if you have to, then you settle for realism. And if progressives do that, and I believe that they do, I don't see anything wrong with that. Now, maybe that's what you mean when you suggest that things are going too fast. Maybe that's the point that you're making. And I know that you're not speaking on behalf of yourself. You're taking a view. But I think that the founding fathers were idealists when they wrote the Constitution. I think Martin Luther King was an idealist. I think all people working for change aim for idealism, and if they have to, they settle for realism.
And with that note, I will say that is an excellent note to end on. I can't thank you enough. This was awesome. This was awesome. This was a great conversation. It really was. It really was. And
thank you so much for having me.
No, thank you for coming. I hope you come again, actually.
I'd be happy to.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. So we can pick these things apart at another time. Jarret, Lovell,
I'm all fired up.
Yeah, you are. Now you can go kick some ass.
Go fight. Thanks, Cameron.
Thank you, Jarret. Have a good one. This studio is funded by my company, C. Jackson Investigations. Need to find someone, run a background check, or catch a cheating spouse? C. Jackson Investigations can handle all of your investigative needs. To learn more, go to cjacksoninvestigations.com. Thank you for tuning in to The Cameron Jackson Show. Remember, you can listen to us on podcast or watch us on YouTube. We want to know what you think. Let us know what you liked, what you didn't like, and what you'd like to see more of. Leave your comments down below. We read them all. You can also contact us via email, CameronJacksonShow@gmail.com. And if you liked what you saw today, give us a like and subscribe. It really helps us out.